Hi there. Thank you for sticking to the last for this talk. I hope you won't be too disappointed. As well as being the co-lead of the Big Data Spoke on Big Data Education for the Northeast Data Hub, I also direct the University of Pennsylvania Center for Learning Analytics. Just to tell you a little bit about us to kind of preface some of this all to be talking about. We conduct research on the data becoming available from online learning. It doesn't really show up well, but there's like zeros and a cloud of zeros and ones flying around the child here. So. Some of our selected projects include trying to replicate findings about student success in MOOCs across dozens of MOOCs. Try to get away from that era of, in my one very small course or in my one very small setting, here's what I find, to kind of integrate across settings. Connecting performance and behavior in MOOCs to participation in the community of practice afterwards. So do people's participation in MOOCs, does it actually influence their lives in any way? And connecting performance and behavior in middle school math homework to students' college enrollment and major. What are students' behaviors that connect to the future trajectories of their lives? And you can imagine that there are some real privacy concerns when you start looking at these kind of data. Common thread across many of my center's projects are connecting fine-grained data at time A with outcome data at time B, which could be, a couple weeks later, but it could be 11 years later. And that requires integrating across data sources in a fashion that's secure and protects privacy. There's a real important aspect to this kind of research, I feel, which is that the educational practices that are effective in the short term aren't always effective in the long term. So a good example of this would be cramming for the test. Who here crammed for tests as an undergrad or high school student? I was worried because there was a hand that wasn't going up. It leads to better performance on the test, but it leads to much more. That's why we do it, right? Because it works, but it leads to much more forgetting after the test. I gave 2 citations here, but cognitive psychologists have known this for much longer than back to 1999. Well-known phenomenon. If you cram, you forget it. That's actually, and there's good scientific evidence that that's based on how human memory works. Only by integrating data on performance and behavior during learning with data on long-term outcomes can we understand which behaviors and strategies are most important for student long-term success. If we only have data from a single course, we'll find out, lo and behold, cramming is good. And we'll think that some behaviors that really don't matter very much matter a great deal. Some things that do matter won't show up right at first. So the big issue is that if we can't link to longitudinal and external data on outcomes in some fashion, automated optimization algorithms, which are becoming more and more popular in online learning, will end up optimizing for performance within the system. And that may, in many cases, hurt student long-term outcomes. So there's a real reason why we need to be able to do longitudinal data linkage. There are, of course, issues with some of the data that you can get through that. Easiest way to link 2 data sources together, get the student's name and birth date. But there are limitations to how much you can do that. For one thing, there's federal law, FERPA, which protects certain types of educational data, specific types of personally identifiable information. And that's an interesting challenge because education right now is generating a lot of data that's not clearly covered under FERPA. There's been a lot of debate over the last 8 years about revising FERPA, but historically, the 2 parties haven't been able to agree on how to do it, so we're kind of stuck with a 1970s set of regulations for how to do this. A couple examples of this would be online learning data and discussion forum data. Not entirely clear where they fit. For one thing, it's essentially impractical. I won't say impossible, but essentially impractical to fully de-identify discussion forum data. This is not a real post, but I've had many of these like this in my MOOC. I didn't want to take a real post because that's the entire thing I'm talking about here. But hi everyone, I'm Naim. I'm a certified public accountant in town. My boss down at business suggests I take a look at this course, and I have to say I found it useful. That's the kind of thing you see. Now, there's a question whether this learner ever really meant for their identity to be private, because they're kind of going out and saying all this information about themselves on a forum that 48,000 people can read. But that's a different story. And for that matter, even if the person at the time of writing it felt okay writing it, they might not want it being shared later. Who wants discussion forum posts from when they're 19 following them forever? I said a couple particularly stupid things on a discussion forum when I was 16. And boy, it took about a decade before it stopped being among the first search terms when you put in my full name.
About a decade until you decided to change your name.
That's right. Yeah. No. Fortunately, Ryan Baker, over time, has become a name that enough other people have, that now when you search for me, you mostly just find like the CBS News anchor in Chicago or the Miami Dolphins football player. But so that's kind of obvious case where it's just not easy to de-identify. But even online learning data with no obvious identifiers can sometimes be re-identified. Here's a real-world example from the Assessments platform, which is a online learning and homework platform used by about 45,000 kids a year in Massachusetts and Maine. It's very effective. It's a good platform. One student made a very unusual error, 74, in their online math homework. Really distinctive. Nobody else had made this error. And then that student tweeted about how I got 74 on this problem. Did anybody else get this? And I say tweet, I really mean Twitter. They put this on Twitter. And if you combine the value 74 and the time in the interaction log data, you can determine exactly who this kid is, right? And then by doing that, you can re-identify what school they're in and get converging evidence on a lot of other kids. So lots of kids can be kind of narrowed down by this one kid's tweet. The odds that you're going to completely prevent this sort of thing are basically zero. That said, you could argue there isn't a huge risk in figuring out which students are doing better or more poorly on their math homework, but perhaps there is. One can easily imagine that students who show specific disengaged behaviors during high school learning, if however things are set, may eventually be less likely to get a college loan. Especially, stories of people, for example, loan providers looking at people's Facebook posts. A parental concern is that online learning data will be used to advertise commercial services. And you could ask, is this a real concern? A lot of parents are terrified by this. It doesn't actually happen very often. There was a survey done by Marie Biankowski and her colleagues. Didn't find much evidence this was actually happening at K-12. But at the university level, it is happening. Some university-level learning management systems recommend commercial tutoring services to struggling students. And again, there's a question, is this okay or not? You could argue it's beneficent. This is a student who's struggling. This is a resource that could help them. On the other hand, other people look at it as something that's kind of an inappropriate marketing of services. If you look at the U.S. Department of Education guidelines for the use of data, they consider it something that definitely shouldn't be done. They actually have guidelines requesting that schools say that their vendors can't do this. Now, like I said, there's relatively few reports of kind of breaches or harm from educational data breaches. But there are a couple examples. One of the more notorious ones is that the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., public schools accidentally posted the disability stats for 12,000 students. This is not kind of the case of like an evil person hacking in or an evil person figuring out from public data sets. This is just somebody kind of just pushing a button and putting something on a public server by mistake. But it happens. There's a great deal of parental concern about this in some places.
More carelessness in the world than malice.
That's right. Absolutely agreed. Relatively few people actually want to be the person who hacked a children's database and used it to sell them products. And it's not usually going to help them, but yeah, there's a lot of people who will kind of casually put something on a server and not realize that the entire server is uploaded to the web. Absolutely true. So there's a great deal of parental concern about this in some places, although, to go back to your point, actually, a lot of the parents are worried about malicious actors, not about careless actors. And we're seeing the emergence of a movement that's very concerned with student privacy, led to the disbanding of the In Bloom initiative. Has anyone here heard of In Bloom? Okay, one hand. So, two hands. In Bloom was a big deal for a lot of parent groups, and honestly for a lot of left-wing and right-wing pundits. What it was it was an initiative funded by the Gates Foundation and by Rupert Murdoch's foundation. And the goal of it was a nonprofit that was going to store data for school districts around the country and make it easier to transfer data between them. So the big idea was that a kid moves from Mississippi to New Hampshire and their data follows them. Right now, the way that happens, because every state has different data guidelines for this, right now the way that happens is literally the records get faxed or emailed and then they get typed in by hand. And in Bloom's goal was to make it so that this data could be disseminated more easily. But some dumb things were said by various people involved in it about how this would enable all kinds of new research and tracking and various things, and parent groups emerged. And in Bloom, basically all the states and cities that got involved in it withdrew, and the funding was withdrawn, and an unbelievable amount of money kind of went to nothing. For an unbelievable amount of money went into something that realistically was probably pretty mild and had not very likely harm. There's been also an emergence of organizations, and I know I'm on video, so I'm going to be a little moderate in my comments, but there's become the emergence of organizations that are purporting to speak for parents and schools, such as One School Privacy Consortium organization, whose leadership is predominantly made up of security consulting firms. Which again, I'm not saying that people who are involved in data security, data privacy consulting are bad people, obviously. But this organization is largely made up of these firms. It recommends very restrictive contracts to schools that, for example, bar the use of data for research or enhancement of educational quality. Recommends security audits to schools and compliance certification of vendors from these companies that kind of make up the leadership of this privacy consortium. And vendors that kind of don't partner with these various security firms are then barred from being used in the schools, including learning software that's nonprofit or university-based and government-funded. Happy to tell people about this kind of when the camera's not running, because I don't want to get involved in various litigation stuff. Not that that's happened yet, but there's definitely been some media attention to this group, and I'd rather it kind of go through those channels than me speaking on YouTube. So to summarize, and I'm not done, this is not the end, but creating high-quality online learning is greatly facilitated by linked longitudinal data, because you need to know what worked in the long term, not just immediately. There are real reasons for concern about data privacy. Even though there's not necessarily space for there's not necessarily that much concern about advertising in the K-12 space. There's more at the university level. There is a degree of carelessness. People are going to make mistakes. And when mistakes get made with people's private data, that is going to have effects. One can imagine scenarios where it will be a real problem. Interestingly, by the way, this is differential between countries, because in some countries, educational data is much freer, and in some countries, it's much more restricted than the United States. The United States is about in the middle for this. The steps being taken, though, based on those real and valid concerns, don't always match the risks. And a few directions that I think are kind of happening and are maybe of use to kind of bringing the space forward. First of all is legal agreements not to attempt to re-identify data. This is being used in a lot of areas, and it's increasingly adopted by online learning systems that share data for scientific research. That doesn't necessarily eliminate careless disclosure, and it also doesn't necessarily eliminate malicious practices, but having a legal agreement in place about not trying to re-identify discussion forum data certainly at least makes it clear to honest and ethical people what they're supposed to be doing with the data they get. Linking data with through trusted brokers, and that was a solution we heard about a couple talks ago. Potentially create brokers who have the personal identifying information, who can link together data sets for use in longitudinal outcome research, so that you don't have to hand out the PII to everybody, but you can just link at a trusted source. One example of this is the Pittsburgh Science and Learning Center data shop. Anyone here heard of that? It's in the education world, especially education research world. It's one of the larger public databases for educational data. It's specifically focused on educational interaction data, so the data that comes from online learning, as opposed to, say, grade data and attendance data. PSLC Data Shop conducts a service for researchers who use their LearnLab school sites so that those researchers can get access to various test data and other things about the students to kind of see what the long-term impacts are without having to directly know who the students are. Also used to, for example, when people do field observations in classrooms, they may have to actually take down kids' names during the field note procedure in the classroom, but then they pass the field notes directly to the data shop people who sanitize out those names and link it to the data. Another one, and none of these are, I don't want to claim we're inventing any of this stuff in education. I know there's a long tradition of this in other areas. These are just some of the steps that people are starting to take more. Conduct analyses on secure servers where the data identifiers are present and can be used to link data but can't be directly accessed. This is the approach that the US Department of Labor uses when they share some of their data sets. You can hack those data sets, but it's probably acceptable for data where the risk is relatively minimal anyways. I feel like saying things like this is probably carrying coal to Newcastle. You guys already know about all these things, but we're still thinking about how to do it best, and that's why I'm excited to be here today, get some guidance and find out if there's anybody interested in these issues. One example of this is the MOOC Replication Framework, or MORPH, that is a project getting started at UPenn, also at Michigan and Illinois, where researchers can kind of submit if-then questions or code to be run on MOOC data. Universities typically don't share their MOOC data between universities. Even with the edX Data Research Data Exchange, it hasn't actually happened, as far as I know. But in this case, researchers who want to work with these larger scale educational data sets can do so without actually the university having to give it over when the university may not want to. So far, this has been used, for example, to replicate 15 research questions across 29 MOOCs using an external researcher from Georgia State's code. So I know that the community here and the folks who left early have a lot to contribute, and that's why I was excited to be here. I'm first and foremost a scientific researcher with educational data. I'm not really, an expert in any of the area. I'm not at all an expert in any of the areas you guys are talking about, although I do manage UPenn's efforts to use MOOC data for research. And I would be excited to connect folks in this room as interested to the developers and researchers who could use their expertise, who would use your expertise to protect student privacy while enhancing students' learning. So thank you very much. This is my just end of talk commercial slide where I say that we have a Twitter and Facebook feed for our research, and we have a MOOC Big Data Education on edX, which boots again June 18 if anyone's interested in learning more about how this stuff goes on in education. That MOOC is partially funded through the support of the Big Data Spoke in Education for the Northeast Hub. Thank you all for your attention, and I'd be delighted to chat. I think I ended just a little bit early. So.
Thank you. Yeah, so plenty of time for questions or discussion.
Sure. I'm from the Census Bureau, and I was responsible for sample design and estimation for 11 educational surveys put out by the Census Bureau. And to get to students or to get to teachers, you have to go through school districts. And something that most of you probably don't know is that the state of Hawaii has exactly one school district for public schools. So you need to get along with them very well if you want to get data from them. In places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, you have townships, you have cities, but in the state of Maryland, where I live, you have county boards of education and you have Baltimore City Board of Education. And so you have very different sizes of school systems as well. So I just wanted to comment that when you're trying to either get data from them or making their data private, it's important to know that the school districts can be very different in size.
That's right, and actually one of the big nightmares, I talk to folks at various large publishers and providers. One of the nightmares that they tell me they have is that they're going to have to negotiate a separate data agreement, slightly different in tiny ways, with every single school district they sell to. That's just incredibly destructive. It's led to the initiatives both at the federal level that try, PTAC, I forget what that stands for, but the Privacy Technical Advisory Committee of the U.S. Department of Education that try to recommend practices and contract language. It's also led to some of these consortiums that I mentioned, that some of which are genuinely bottom up from schools and some of which are people kind of trying to come in and make some opportunity for themselves. To some extent, if you get standard contracts, you might say a bad standard contract is better than no standard contract at all, but if the standard contract is of a nature that completely eliminates educational research and educational improvement, then we set education back in the United States to 1990 with no hope of going forward. So it's a really big challenge, and it's one that has already had its impacts because some of the bigger school districts can be very bureaucratic, and so you're seeing increasing amounts of educational research happening with data from suburban districts because those are the ones that are easiest to negotiate with. However, what works for I don't know, a student in, let's say, Kendall Park, New Jersey, may not be exactly the same as what works for a student in the Bronx.
So are you, I mean, is this tangential to what you're doing, or is it important for your efforts? Because our data sharing spoke is actually trying to work on something that will be relevant, and it's not going to be ready for the next probably 2 or 3 years, but the idea is to create 60% or 70% of a standardized data sharing agreement and leave the rest of it to negotiation rather than the whole thing, and also integrate it into the underlying data sharing platform, which could be relevant to handle some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great things about the Northeast Big Data Hub is these connections. René, I haven't really been chatting with those folks, but I'd love to chat more. I mean, it is kind of secondary in some ways to my research interests, but it's very important to get right for that research to occur. So I'm kind of, I've definitely personally been involved in some kind of work to try to keep things on the rails with this. And the International Educational Data Mining Society, which I used to be president of, has a policy chairperson who also thinks about these issues. So maybe he and I could get looped into some of those discussions. I'd love to help.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.
Have you found then that just like it can be easier to get data from rural schools versus urban, is there a lot more of the data coming from MOOCs and things where you can just have a user agreement that like there's many fewer entities that have to agree to participate?
That's a great question. Ironically, even though there's tons of data from MOOCs individually, there's been surprisingly little work done to cut across universities and really explore the full size of the data sets. Most analyses are done on single MOOCs. There are exceptions like at MIT and Harvard X, but still most of their papers are on like 4 or 5 MOOCs. As far as I know, our 29 MOOC analysis is the largest one that's been published. I could be wrong, and I'd love for someone to tell me I'm wrong, but I think it's the largest one been published that actually uses the interaction data. There have been larger ones that take surveys at the beginning and end, but that's not the same volume.
Right.
Why is that? Well, there's 2 issues. One is the data sharing, and I actually think that is a barrier because most universities don't want it outside their university. They think it's of a strategic resource. Penn and Edinburgh are 2 universities. Edinburgh's also in this, I forgot them. Penn, Edinburgh, and Michigan are all interested in kind of making it so people can use their data. We know that it's going to be a non-starter to actually give the data to people, but if we can create an infrastructure where they can put up their code or do the analyses on a server, but the data remains on campus, or more accurately in Amazon Web Service Cloud, but one owned by Penn, for example, then that may be something that's feasible. There is one other issue actually that I think has also slowed this work, which is that by the time you get to these really big data sets, you really have to be able to work with cloud computing. And even today, there are relatively few researchers in education who have labs that can handle that. We're certainly kind of still catching up. It's one of the things our big data spoke is trying to work on.
The risks to identification of data that you described seem, as you were saying, not like they aren't maybe that likely, or they're sort of a little offhand. And the value you could get from large analyses of large data sets, including ones beyond this, seem really substantial. I'm wondering if you have ambitions beyond what you're planning for the spoke. You said you mentioned your role in that society for large data analysis for educational data to advance the cause of open data of these types. And I don't know what the policies are for No Child Left Behind or the other kinds of standardized testing data that happen on a national level, but it's not downplaying the importance of the privacy, but I just think that the cost benefit or the risk, benefit risk ratio that we've been talking about, it seems like the benefit is really high, and I'm not sure how high the realistic risks are.
I'm glad you feel that way. I happen to believe personally that the benefits of this kind of research are really big. When you look at the actual impacts on student outcomes from better teaching or pedagogical practices, or from the use of one of the small number of systems that have been developed based on bigger data, systems like reasoning mind or assessments or cognitive tutor, they're much more effective than traditional educational practices, and they have the potential to get better still. However, a lot of people are very worried about their child's data being used to sell them services. One of the things that I find particularly ironic is that sometimes I feel like as a society we're coming close to deciding that it's okay to use data to sell kids a soft drink, but not okay to use data to help them learn. But I don't think that's because if you look at a lot of what happened with the closing of InBloom or the parent networks that tried to get rid of Common Core, there's a lot, it's really easy to make the argument, this evil corporation wants to take my child's data to make money. And really hard to make the argument that educational data has a role for improving students' outcomes. I think that one is a much more visceral message than the other and sounds like a much higher risk. But I happen to agree. While there are real risks in terms of privacy, and there are real potential things that could be problematic, most use of educational data is totally benign, and almost everybody who wants to use educational data wants to use it for totally benign purposes, which then just puts us into the carelessness space, and that's a problem that's easier to solve.
Sir. A long, long time ago, when I was in high school, which is longer ago than anything else, I was part of what I believe was intended to be a longitudinal study of students in my high school. Yeah. As far as I know, it was applied to all students in the high school. I don't know. I remember filling out a questionnaire with lots and lots of questions. I think that this was administered by somebody at the University of Pittsburgh, but I'm not really sure. And I just wondered if is that perhaps the origin of the organization that you mentioned on your last slide? Potentially? This was in the 1960s, I have to say.
There were several projects of that nature in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. One out of Harvard was one of the few that actually managed to, that started in the 30s, was one of the few that actually, I think 30s, was one of the few that actually managed to really go full lifespan. The trick with that model of longitudinal study is that it requires tracking people down, following up, and getting their compliance. The difference to this era of longitudinal research is that you get somebody's compliance once, and then you can just keep tracking them. You can keep finding out what happens because they're going to post what job they take on LinkedIn or other websites. That's going to change what website it is. The National Student Clearinghouse keeps records on where people go to college and what they major in. There's a lot of data sources out there, where you can link it together. You still want to make sure that people are okay with this, but you don't have to keep getting them to actually go the trouble of spending an hour filling out a survey. I think I'm also in a couple people's longitudinal data sets. I went to a gifted program in middle school, and I get these surveys from them every few years. And I have to be honest, I don't fill out the darn survey because it's going to take me 6 hours. The NDSEG, I really shouldn't be saying this on tape, but I got a graduate fellowship, and that one takes probably it would take me an entire week to fill out their online survey because they want me to enter in their incredibly slow web form every single publication I have, and what the city it was in, and the city of the publisher, and when you deal with those kind of data, it's really hard to do longitudinal research. When you deal with this kind of data, it's hard, but not nearly as hard.
Does the National Center for Educational Statistics have a mission, the mandate to do longitudinal studies as well? I feel like
They do, and they have things like the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. Again, their paradigm of research, it's what I was just talking about.
They're the ones asking for these surveys, basically.
They're not the only ones, but they do these really long surveys. They require people's compliance. It's a really expensive way. You have to do multiple follow-ups, like the census, almost. Not nearly as thorough, but it's like you have to do lots and lots of data collection. You have to deal with missing data and imputation. It's just a much more expensive way to track down people longitudinally. Whereas, for example, our project where we track from middle school mathematics homework to college enrollment and major, we were able to do an over a decade longitudinal study for well under $1 million. And I should say, of 7,000 or so students.
Questions? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.